In just a moment. I wanted to let you know that we have posted the link to those slides for this presentation in the chat box, so please check that. Dr. Robson will be pausing periodically through the webinar today and will be answering the questions, so as they come up, please post them in the questions box. This webinar is being recorded, and approximately 3 to 5 business days from now, it will be posted at the same link that is provided in the chat box. So on that note, I will turn this over to Dr. Robson.
Well, good afternoon. Hi, I'm Mark Robson. I'm a faculty member at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and I will spend the next couple hours with you to review the environmental health section of the public health exam. What I thought we would do is, with this wonderful technology, your questions will pop up, and we'll pause at probably around each hour to answer the questions. Some of them may require a little more research, but we'll try to answer them as easily and quickly as possible. And we'll take a 10-minute biology break at the end of the first hour and the second hour, just to keep everyone on point and listening. So what we divided this presentation up into an introduction to environmental health and sort of the core elements that we think are important in environmental health. Remember, of course, this is very broad. For some of you who are environmental health specialists, this will be somewhat of a cursory review. For folks that are specializing in epidemiology or health education, family health, or biostatistics, this will probably be about as much environmental health as you care to have. So we'll have an introduction, and then we'll talk about the key elements that are always part of this: toxicology, risk assessment, air, water, food, and children, and that'll provide us with sort of an overview of the information that really embodies environmental health and that you need to have to go forward. So if we look at the early definition, health, defined by WHO way back in 1948, was a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely just the absence of disease. And it's interesting that it took almost 50 years for environment to make its way into the WHO definition, all that which is external to the individual human host. So it can be divided into physical, biological, social, cultural, and all of those things that influence health status in populations. So it's interesting to me that in environmental health we don't see it really coming on the scene too much until fairly recently. Now, when we talk about environmental health, of course, we look at environmental health at both the local and global scale. And you know, when we talk about a local focus, it can be something like the air quality in Los Angeles, a toxic waste site in New Jersey. Just as a little aside, in addition to having the Super Bowl this weekend, we can brag about having the most Superfund sites in the United States. Always a great thing to brag about. But those are very local things. And of course, the global issues are the ones that we deal with on a regular basis, things like the threat of climate change and global warming, antibiotic-resistant infectious diseases. Those are global kinds of issues, but local usually are something like the air quality, the water quality, or a particular environmental problem. And both of those contribute to what we study in environmental health. It's interesting that the WHO says about a quarter of the global disease burden is caused by environmental health exposures that can be averted, that we can avoid and reduce. Education, training, and carefully targeted intervention, according to WHO, would go ahead and help us address about a third of the disease problems in children under the age of 5 because they are caused by environmental exposures. And preventing environmental risk could save as many as 4 million lives a year just with children as we look at the changes in developing countries. Remember, so much of the world, of course, 85% of the world, depending on the World Bank definition and others, is considered developing as opposed to developed where we all reside. So when we make the case for environmental health, the WHO says, well, there's about 13 million deaths annually due to preventable environmental diseases. Nearly a third of those are in those least developed regions, and they're due to environmental causes. 40% of the deaths from malaria and almost all the deaths from diarrheal disease could be prevented just by better environmental management. The four main diseases influenced by poor environments, of course, are diarrhea, lower respiratory infections, unintentional injuries, and malaria. It's always amazing to me that in 2014, as we go forward, that malaria, which is something that we have battled since the beginning of time, still ranks up in the top 4. Measures could be taken now to reduce these environmental disease burdens just by good sanitation promotion, better methodology for water storage, safer and cleaner fuels, an awareness of the safety in the built environment, more judicious use of toxic substances in the home and the workplace, and better resource management. So let's look at a really important graph. This is taken from the WHO, and this is the population without access to safe water. And as you can see, in some parts of the African continent, it's close to 60 to 80%. Pretty remarkable number. We forget that here in the northern hemisphere, where almost no one doesn't have access to safe drinking water. If you overlay the drinking water accessibility to life expectancy, once again you see a very close correlation, that the African continent has, in many places, a remarkably low life expectancy. And so they track fairly well those environmental causes, as well as things like nutrition and hunger and overall health status, control of infectious disease, track very closely with life expectancy. It's a little humbling, too, for those of us on this webinar in the U.S., which are most of the participants, that we are not number one, that our colleagues in Japan and Canada and Australia actually have longer life expectancy than we do. One of the things in environmental occupational health that we worry about, of course, is the association of the environment and occupational disease. Many countries around the world, especially those on the African and South American continents, are considered developing. As I mentioned earlier, about 80 to 85% of the world's population lives in developing countries. It's a pretty amazing statistic when we realize that we currently have 7 billion people, and in not too long a time we're going to have 9 billion people. Every morning when you wake up, there are 250,000 people that weren't here yesterday. That's just a remarkable number. And while all dimensions of public health are critical, those of us in environmental health like to think that we really have a key role here, maybe one of the most important, if not the most important role, because we are sort of charged with protecting those resources. And while 80% of the world's population live in developing countries, more than 80% of the world's occupational and environmental health problems are in those countries. So there's a disproportionate burden of those kinds of diseases and exposures in the developing world, things like silicosis, like lead poisoning and benzene poisoning. If you look at the trends from 50 years ago in the United States, it's interesting that those trends are a lot like what we were prior to the Second World War, prior to the 1950s. But we are now, of course, in a pretty advanced state, and we have managed to ship our manufacturing and those dirty jobs to other places. So with that long introduction, let's begin to discuss those basic principles in environmental health that you need to know as you prepare to sit for the exam. The father of toxicology is, of course, Paracelsus, and as some of you know the story, he actually lost a patient, and so he was taken in court. We think of malpractice as a recent phenomenon, when in fact malpractice is a very old phenomenon. Paracelsus was a physician who lived in the 1500s. And so he was taken to court, and they were going to get him for killing this patient. And he goes, well, wait a minute. I didn't kill them. I just gave them too large a dose. And all things are poison, and nothing is without poison. Only the dose permits something not to be poisonous, which is the quote. I've given it to you both in German and in English. And of course, in public health, there's a wonderful little textbook by Alice Ottoboni that many of us use in environmental health that says the dose makes the poison. And if you had to distill what Paracelsus was saying, it is the dose that makes the poison. So for the next few slides, we're going to talk about that because it's such a critical part of what we do in environmental health. So remember what your grandmother said to you, that everything in moderation. And while Grandma may not have been a board toxicologist, she was spot on as far as the application to public health. It's all about the dose. And so here's a picture of the famous Paracelsus, a rather portly fellow, I suppose, but given the credit of being the father of modern toxicology. Now, not to share equal time, Lucrezia Borgia is often, with a little humor, considered to be the mother of toxicology. She had also been called one of the most depraved women in history. But as the stories go, of course, she kept bottles in her boudoir with perfume that was used to seduce and poison and kill her suitors. And so, according to legend, she had several pieces of jewelry that were laced with arsenic, and that was an effective way for her to dispose of her suitors, not until after she secured their resources. If you like the Showtime series, The Borgias, you will appreciate this very interesting woman. And there she is, as you see, a rather striking and attractive woman, but nonetheless one of the mother of toxicology, and many of us would like to think of her as an applied toxicologist. So what's a term that we need to know? Well, one of the terms we need to know is the term hazard. This is often used as a synonym for toxicity. Hazard is, in fact, a more complex concept than just toxicity. It includes the conditions of use, which is a really important concept for us in public health. So a hazard is the inherent ability of a chemical to do harm by virtue of whether it's explosive or flammable, corrosive or toxic. And also, and the important part here, is the ease with which you could come in contact with that chemical. And one of the basic principles in environmental health is if you have a process that you're trying to reduce exposure to workers, of course, you want to try first by choosing a chemical that's less toxic. You make a conscious decision if there are 3 products that you could use in a particular kind of venture or endeavor in a manufacturing process, you use the least toxic. The second one, of course, is that you try to install administrative controls and use proper kinds of technology to reduce exposure. And also, you try to, if you don't have success with the first 2, use something like personal protective equipment. If you can't use a less toxic chemical, the toxic chemical has to be what's used in this process, then we want to reduce the worker's exposure to it. And we would use PPE as an approach, a respirator, a Tyvek suit, hat and goggles, the right kinds of gloves, so that we can reduce the contact between the toxin and the individual. So in toxicology, we pretty much do a dose-time relationship, which can more easily be described as how much and how often. And the 2 terms that we need to remember for our exam, of course, are acute toxicity and chronic toxicity. And acute, remember, refers to the ability of a substance to do systemic damage from a one-time, relatively short exposure. We would worry about an acute event if a tanker truck turned over in the middle of a major intersection in an urban area or suburban area. If we came in contact with an exposure, a gas leak, a pipe explodes in a laboratory manufacturing process, that would be that acute exposure, and we'd worry about the results that would happen to the receptor, to the person. Chronic is a much more complex issue, and it's a harmful systemic effect that happens over a longer period of time, typically with low levels of exposure. Something at a low level that's in the drinking water that you're exposed to on a daily basis, and that puts you at risk. The air quality in your building, a contaminant in the groundwater, something like that, where it's low level over time. In the workplace environment, where you know that there might be monitoring, and the monitoring looks for a particular chemical over time to avoid a chronic exposure. So acute and chronic are two important terms. For acute toxicity, we have a very simple measure. It's an index. It's used by lots of folks. It's the guide. I always remind folks when we talk to the lay public, and all of us on this webinar, and many of our colleagues, of course, as public health professionals, we try to explain very complex and complicated phenomena to the lay public who aren't trained in science, let alone in public health. So the LD50 gives us an index, or at least a starting point, to try to explain how toxic something is or isn't. And LD stands for lethal dose. The subscript 50, as you recall, stands for the part of the population that's affected. So if you have an LD50, 50% of the population that was exposed would in fact have the lethal dose. They would die. In LD0, there would be no deaths, and in LD100, there would be 100% kill. If we were trying to design a chemical where we were looking for its efficacy to kill 100% of a pest problem, for instance, or to be effective to wipe out a particular kind of bacteria or virus, then the LD100 would be a really important number for us to get a total kill. Units for LD50 are milligrams of chemical per kilogram of body weight. Now, why is that important? It's important because this is a dose. So for someone like myself, who sadly weighs about 240 pounds, you would need more of a particular product than for someone who's fit and healthy and weighs 150 pounds, because it's milligrams of chemical per kilogram of body weight. I suppose one of the few advantages of being overweight is that you may be able to withstand a higher exposure of a particular toxic chemical. One of the things that we have a hard time explaining to folks then is that the LD50 and acute toxicity is inversely related. That means the lower the number, the more toxic the chemical. And that's often a problem when we are describing the toxicity of something in a public meeting to elected officials, because someone will say, well, the LD50 for this is only 5. Well, then you want to run versus an LD50 of 5,000. So keep in mind, the lower the number, the more toxic the material. And just for some kitchen measurement here, we assume that a child would weigh about 10 kilograms, that's about 22 pounds, and a healthy adult about 70 kilograms, or 154 pounds. And if the LD50 of the compound is measured to be less than 5, then it takes barely a drop to be lethal for a child, and about a 1/16 of a teaspoon for an adult. If we move down to the bottom of the slide, we see that if the LD50 was quite high, over 5,000, that it would take an enormous amount, over 4 tablespoons to affect a child, and over 30 tablespoons to affect an adult. So it's pretty significant. So LD50, lower number, more toxic. The 50 stands for the percent of the population that is dead as a result of the exposure. We also have LC50 for concentrations, for vapors. LC50 is not a big feeding study. It's done a little differently. You go ahead and expose animals, usually rats or mice, to different concentrations in the air. We expose them for a 1-hour period, and then we see how many of them die over a 2-week period. And there are different protocol for all the different studies, but this is just sort of a rule of thumb. So let's look at some everyday chemicals that may or may not be toxic. Interestingly, vitamin D, which we all need, is a highly acutely toxic chemical. Okay? It's 10 milligrams per kilogram, or about 400,000 international units per kilogram. That LD50 for vitamin D is the same LD50 for the very potent organophosphate insecticide parathion. So think about that. Vitamin D and parathion have the same acute toxicity. Now, vitamin D is exempt from hazardous substance labeling because it's in food, it's in milk, it's sold as a drug, as a vitamin supplement. But if it wasn't, we were just starting de novo with this chemical would in fact carry a poison label. Now, to stay healthy, you need about 10 micrograms per day, the average person. That's about 400 international units, as opposed to the toxic level of 400,000 international units per kilogram. Sodium fluoride is another one of those chemicals where it's all about the dose. Remember, Paracelsus and Grandma were right. A high acute oral toxicity for sodium fluoride is about 35 milligrams per kilogram. And yet, if you are not on city water, you're probably giving this to your children at about 1 or 2 milligrams per day for good dental health. Now, this is one of those ones where the window between being a good thing and causing a problem is a very small window. So typically we give low chronic doses to children, 1 or 2 milligrams per day for good dental health. And if you double that dose to 3 or 4, you get mottling, discoloration of the enamel on the teeth. It's interesting. You know, parents should never let their children self-medicate. So I grew up in a rural area before this became popular, and my home is in the area when my daughter was young. The pediatrician prescribed the fluoride tablets, and every evening before she went to bed she took one. And I tasted one time just to see how they taste, because she seemed to never complain about taking the tablet. And it was very nice. It was a watermelon flavor one. It was quite good. Now, why is that important? Well, that's important because 1 tablet, or about 2 milligrams, is just the right dose to fight cavities and for good dental health. 4 milligrams, or 2 tablets, and remember, if the kids are allowed to administer themselves, will actually cause this damage. A few years back, we did a series of trainings on environmental health to public health nurses, and I was giving a presentation at Hunter College in New York City, and one of the nurses pointed out to me that she had lived in rural New York and then took a job in Manhattan. She had gone from a well where she gave her children the fluoride tablets to city water that already had the fluoride in it, and over time she noticed serious discoloration of her children's teeth. And she hadn't realized when she had moved into the city and had city water that had been fluoridated that in fact the kids were getting a double dose of fluoride. And her children, particularly her son, as she shared, had serious mottling or discoloration of his teeth and actually had to have them capped because they had gotten so discolored and unattractive. So this is one of those things where a little bit is an enormous public health benefit, and too much causes, even a little bit too much causes some cosmetic problems. And of course, high levels, as we know, there's a whole literature on bone cancer and fluoridosis and other things. But just this narrow window can make a difference. So how do we get exposed? We gave 2 quick little examples of vitamin D and sodium fluoride. How do we get exposed to things? Well, there are lots of routes of exposure. But for our discussion today and for your preparation, we want to know the 3 big ones. Penetration through the skin, commonly known as dermal exposure. Absorption through the lungs, inhalation. And finally, passage across the walls of the gastrointestinal tract, or oral. So the big 3, of course, are dermal, inhalation, and oral. And here's a little graph that gives us a schematic for how this happens. You have the toxic agent, you have the exposure dose, and then it's going to get in the system one of those 3 ways: skin, lungs, or GI tract. From there, we have absorption. and we have an internal dose. That internal dose can make its way into the bloodstream and head towards a target organ. We call it distribution and metabolism, and then goes to a particular organ or tissue. The dermal route is the most common way that we come in contact with chemicals. Thankfully, the skin does a very good job in protecting us. If we were to stretch out our skin, we have about 20 square feet. Kind of a bad visual, I know. The second most common way to have exposure, of course, is via inhalation. And while the skin is an effective barrier for exposure, the lungs are a particularly poor barrier. If you were to go in and take your lung and stretch it and look at all the surface area, it's about 750 square feet of lung surface. So it's an enormous amount of lung surface. Now, why is this important when it comes to exposure? Well, remember that the function of the lungs is to deliver oxygen from the air to the blood and to take out the CO2 from the blood and back into the air. And so the lung surface is extremely delicate. It's about 1 cell thick, very small membrane. It's why you can have oxygen pass very easily into the alveolar space and make its way to the blood. As a practical thing, it's also why you smoke pot instead of eat pot, because you can get that high very quickly. Same thing with cigarette smoke. In addition to the systemic nature, there's also the physical challenge with inhalation, where you just have particulate matter or a chemical from an industrial process like silica or asbestos, and they damage the lung surfaces, so you get asbestosis or silicosis. And there are a whole series of these respiratory diseases that workers encounter: cotton dust, coal dust, sugarcane pulp, dust from confined animal feeding, the old miner's lung, or the coal dust we typically talk about, black lung. Cotton dust, the disease is called bisonosis. Farmer's lung, they sometimes are called brown lung. Farmers who work with confined animal feeding or CAFO operations. And collectively, we call these pneumoconioses. And you can see from the schematic, where it comes in. Our body tries very hard to defend us. The first line of defense, of course, when you breathe through your nose, are the nose hairs. Not attractive features of our body, but certainly very efficient as far as environmental protectants. So they would screen out a lot of the particulate matter. And second, we have, as it goes into the throat, people clear their throat. That's a defense mechanism. And then finally, with very fine particles, we get very concerned because they make their way into the deep lung, particles that are less than 2.5 microns. The oral route is through ingestion, mainly through the food that we eat, the water that we drink. Chemicals enter the body and they are absorbed mostly along the GI tract. Absorption can occur anywhere from the beginning of the system to the end, from your mouth to your rectum. The majority of absorption takes place along in the small intestine, but it can take place anywhere from the beginning to the end of the system. As an example, nitroglycerin is absorbed through the mucous membranes of the mouth. That's why it's taken and placed under the tongue. If you have someone that's in a cardiac problem, they take and they place the nitro pill under the tongue, and the absorption happens quite quickly. A good example of what happens in the small intestine is alcohol. It's absorbed rapidly in the stomach as well as in the intestine. It's why you see the effects so quickly. Very often if someone goes out for a drink and they haven't had any food for a while, depending on, remember, it's a dose response too. So there are a couple things in play. People who drink a lot and drink on a regular basis have a little better ability to withstand the alcohol than someone who is not very often a drinker and takes it in, especially on an empty stomach. People will go ahead and eat while they're drinking the alcohol, you'll see a delayed effect of the alcohol because it is in the stomach with the food. Often people will make the mistake of saying, well, before I go out, I'm going to eat a big meal so I don't get drunk. Well, you're legally just as drunk as you would be if you didn't have that big meal. It's just that you delay the effects of it because of the absorbance interruption of the stomach and the food. Sort of like the person who leaves the party and before they go they say, well, I have to sober up now and I'm going to drink a lot of coffee. You effectively become a wide awake drunk. You are still intoxicated. The caffeine doesn't do anything to change that. It just makes you more anxious and more on edge. And so when we do our studies, of course, to try and determine what is toxic, they're typically done on animal studies. Rats and mice are the most popular ones. It's important because the animals become models or surrogates for you and me. We base the toxicology and the risk assumptions on animal models. The question, though, becomes, what's the best model? What best represents you and I? All right, is it a man or a monkey? Are they similar or dissimilar? Is it a rat or a mouse? And as an example, monkeys do respond to methanol the same as we do as humans. Monkeys do not respond to nitrobenzene the same as a man. And the use of animal data is important because the animal data that was collected more than half a century ago, rather, impacted the legislation that we have, the Food Additives Amendment, known as the Delaney Amendment from back in 1958, made a point that a food additive is considered a carcinogen if it causes cancer in any animal species at any level. So they would do studies. They would see that this particular compound was cancer-causing, and they would immediately prohibit its use in food. But back when Congressman Delaney pushed his legislation, we measured things in parts per 100. And of course now, you know, parts per trillion are fairly commonplace, especially for environmental contaminants. And so at the time, the technology allowed pretty much parts per 100, and so it was not unusual to have lots of samples that showed no detectable level. As we've gotten more sophisticated with our detection and laboratory analysis, and now we find things in parts per trillion and smaller even, it is there at some level. That we call this concept of vanishing zero, but so many challenges that we have regarding environmental health and toxicology is that we know that we're going to find these things when we look for them, just because of the persistence and the wide range of commerce and how things make their way into the environment. So it does cause a bit of a challenge. Age affects toxicity. Age has an influence in many models. As an example, DDT, the chlorinated insecticide of Rachel Carson fame, the famous insecticide, is not acutely toxic to newborn rats. However, it becomes more toxic as the rat matures. So what's happened is the organ system in the rat that would be a target organ for the toxicity, when it's not developed, toxicity doesn't occur. As the rat ages, of course, then the toxicity becomes more of a problem because now those organ systems are in place and that can happen. The adult LD50 is about 200 to 300 milligrams per kilogram for DDT in these rats. Organophosphate pesticide parathion is more acutely toxic to newborn rats than it is to adult rats, so quite the opposite. So DDT, when the rat gets older, parathion and organophosphate, both pesticides, both insecticides, but one works more on the younger, and that would be the organophosphate, and one works more on the mature, that would be the DDT. So the age difference is usually a function of body systems and the ability to metabolize a foreign chemical, a xenobiotic, and in this case, most of the time this happens in the liver where the metabolism takes place. Sex has a role in whether something is toxic or not. As an example, male rats are 10 times more sensitive to liver damage than are female rats from chronic oral exposure to DDT. So to translate that, if we fed male and female rats the DDT, we would see much higher rates of liver damage. It's a androgen-mediated effect. If you castrate that rat, you won't see those striking differences. The results will be the same as the female rat. You have some pretty angry rats, but the important thing is that you can see it's a hormone-mediated activity. So if you eliminate the hormone source, you eliminate the toxicity. So let's do one of my favorite little exercises now. Let's look at some dose response. And on the x-axis, we have the dose, typically given in milligrams per kilogram for this exercise. On the y-axis, we have the response. And the response in this particular case is mortality, because this is an LD50 line. And you can see that as we plot this, we fed the rats, we looked for the number that died, and usually when you do these studies, you have a range of doses, and you have the same kind of rat or the same kind of mouse or other test animal, and you feed them at different rates, those different doses, and you look for the effects. And clearly, as we go ahead, as we increase the dose, we see an increase in the mortality. And the LD50 for this compound, I'll give you a second to look at it. And since I can't hear you, I'll have to tell you what it is. Okay, just take a second, look at the graph. X-axis is dose, y-axis is response, in this case mortality. And you can see that the LD50 for this example is about 220 milligrams per kilogram. So it's fairly toxic. Now we're going to look at a different concept, and we want to look at these two lines. And I'm not trying to blind you. You know, I once gave this talk, part of it, and I said, okay, now look at this one and this one and this one and this one. And someone yelled, I'm not taking an eye exam. As you know, when you go to the ophthalmologist, he or she will keep reversing the lenses to try and see which one is more clear for you. But what I wanted to demonstrate with this slide and this slide is not to drive you crazy this afternoon, but to talk about the fact that there's a difference in the slope. And so for the first example, this one is unitless because I just want you to look at the slope of the dose response curve, but you can see the slope is quite steep. And this particular one, the slope is not steep for the LD50 line. Now, what's important about this? Well, it's important, it's important because when we look at this particular slide, we see it's a very steep, and this very steep kind of line reminds us that the lowest dose, where we have LD0, and the highest dose, where we have LD100, is actually quite a narrow range of doses. So it really, there isn't a lot of movement or room for error. We can have no resultant deaths, and if we get just a slight increase in the dose from the LD50, say, just a little bit more, we can have 100% of the population die. So that's really quite an important thing to see in the steepness of the slope of the LD50 line. Whereas our second example, there's quite a wide range of doses between no effect and the effect that we have when we have 100% mortality. So it's a wide range. So from a public health perspective, let's just use as an example that both of these chemicals, so you and I are the public health expert, and someone has two different chemicals for a particular kind of treatment. Maybe they're going to fumigate public housing, or they're going to spray for West Nile mosquito control or control West Nile virus or something. And they present two chemicals at a public setting. And so the town fathers and the interested public look at this, and I would not just say, well, what's the LD50? Because that's important, obviously. But I'd want to know the range of doses, because you and I know that folks are not particularly careful, that sometimes we can find ourselves with someone who's maybe not as careful or cautious, and so they might accidentally have a higher dose. So with our second chemical, we still have a wide enough range, enough of a margin of safety that we could make a mistake and still probably not have, a serious public health problem. So let's move on, and let's talk for a minute about chronic toxicity. Chronic toxicity was first looked at back with occupational illness, because the physicians of the time noticed that there were poor health status in folks who had really difficult, dirty, hard trades, people who were miners, people who worked with pottery, people who worked with metals. Hippocrates described severe colic in people who extracted metals, and what Hippocrates was really describing, of course, was lead poisoning. Pliny the Elder wrote about mercury poisoning in miners from quicksilver mines in Spain. So the occupational physician, looking at people with really difficult, hard jobs many, many, many years ago, were the first people to sort of describe the phenomenon of chronic toxicity, but as it related to occupational illness. The dose-response curves vary. If you take a risk assessment course, most schools of public health have them, so I bet a lot of people on the webinar today have taken those courses. Some schools have very quantitative courses with a lot of mathematics, and they're taught at a very high level. Other schools have a more general risk course. Our school happens to have a pretty general risk assessment course. I used to teach it. And so we would simplify it and talk about the fact that while there are many, many models for chronic toxicity and for trying to look at effects, this is a very simplified one in this slide 35. And we see a period of time where there's an exposure, and as we go across with the increasing dose, that would be the x-axis, we really don't see an effect, and then we'll hit a threshold. We'll hit a point where all of a sudden that particular exposure triggers a different kind of response. And so then, as we increase the dose, as you can see, the effect, whether this is a toxic effect as we're describing in this example, or a positive effect, such as therapeutic drug, as we go across, we'll start to see increasing dose with increasing effect. And then finally, we find ourselves at a point where we hit the maximum. And then we have maximum effect. You can only hit 100%. You can't go over that. You can kill all of the population, you can't kill more than all of the population. So there's lots and lots of complicated models for chronic toxicity. This is just one little simplified one, just to have an example for us today. A couple chemicals that have made their way into the market that have had some serious toxic effects. Thalidomide is one of the more famous ones, as many of you know. It was marketed outside the U.S. in the late 1950s, and it was used as a sedative to combat nausea in pregnant women, used as a sleeping pill, and used to treat morning sickness during pregnancy. It was withdrawn from the market in 1961 when it was discovered to have been a human teratogen. We're going to talk about that term in a moment. And what's interesting is that they tested a range of animal species, but they didn't necessarily test the animals that would react to the thalidomide exposures with a model that's similar to the way that humans react to thalidomide exposures. And here is the chemical thalidomide. Some of you are chemists, organic chemists, biochemists, and you enjoy chemical representations. Okay, you'll like to see the chemical formula. Others of you are terrified by this slide. You need not be terrified. It's just an example. Show you that it's actually fairly straightforward chemistry. Thalidomide is still used today for different reasons, but here is a warning label on the thalidomide container. And I think this is very exciting, and it shows you how complicated toxicology can be in a public health setting. So this is an important patient warning for thalidomide. When a pregnant woman takes thalidomide 34 to 50 days after the beginning of her last menstrual period, there is a risk of 20% or greater for the baby to have phocomelia. And this is what's so interesting about this compound, is that if you took it earlier than that window of 34 days, you probably didn't see any effect. And if you took it later than the 50 days, you probably didn't see any effect. But in that narrow window of just a couple of weeks, that's when phocomelia occurs. Phocomelia, of course, is the very short or missing arms and legs. And also you have some problems with hearing and missing ears and deafness. And here are some pictures taken from an article from Great Britain of children who suffered with phocomelia. And it's just an absolutely horrible condition. And many of these little children had a very short lifespan. But there are survivors. There are people that have this condition. There's a famous European conductor who has phocomelia and is a renowned conductor. So people do survive, but not at a very high level. So thalidomide was a bad actor. It was taken off the market in Europe. It was thankfully never put on the market in the United States. And there's a wonderful book out you might want to read sometime. I have a list of books I give my students called Dr. Robson's Airplane Books. Now, I always like to have a book physically in my hand when I fly. Most people now, of course, have a tablet or a Nook or some more sophisticated device. I have a book. But if you read the stories about thalidomide today, you'll see that thalidomide is still used in the marketplace. It's actually manufactured very close to our Rutgers campus here in New Jersey, and it's approved for treatment of the very painful and disfiguring sores that people have when they have Hansen's disease or leprosy. It's also related, it's used in HIV treatment. So it is still in the marketplace, but with that very clear warning that women who are of childbearing age or could be pregnant or plan on getting pregnant do not take this because they want to avoid the problem of phocomelia. Another example, as we get close to our first break, is that of DES, or diethylstilbestrol. This product was prescribed in the United States. It was prescribed between 1940 and 1970, and it was used to prevent miscarriages and high-risk pregnancies. What's interesting is that the female offspring of the women who took the diethylstilbestrol had quite high levels of vaginal adenocarcinomas when they were young, between 16 and 20. And that was linked back to their fetal exposure to diethylstilbestrol. It is guessed that maybe 1 in every 1,000 pregnancies in that time window were exposed to DES because it was so widely prescribed. And here is the structure of DES, in case you ever wondered. And I know most of you are rolling your eyes. Of the 79 people, we had 80, so obviously one person couldn't take it anymore. We have 79 people watching along here on the webinar, and hopefully the chemical formula didn't frighten that one person. But here's an ad from a medical journal back in 1957, and it's for DES. This formulation is Desplex, and you can see where it says recommended for all routine prophylaxis in all pregnancies. 96% live delivery with Desplex. Bigger, stronger babies. So it was a product that was marketed aggressively in the U.S. and other places. And as it turns out, the results for the offspring, so not mom, but the children that mom had, Females, we had vaginal and cervical carcinomas, uterine abnormalities, higher risk for ectopic pregnancies. For the longest time, we just focused on the girls, but then we realized the boys also had some problems. And if you look at the data, abnormal genitalia, microphallus, hypospadias, epididymal cysts, and undescended testes. So these had direct effects on the offspring of both sexes. So we are at 1 o'clock, and so I would like to take a 10-minute break. That'll give me a chance to look at some of your questions. Hopefully I'll be able to answer them, and I will try to answer as many as I can before we start our second topic. And so it is now 1 o'clock even, so let's make sure that we're available again at 1:10. Okay? Good, thank you. We'll all be back in a bit. Okay, well, as promised, we'll get back to work now. A couple of questions. There was a question specifically about leprosy treatment. I am not an infectious disease doc, and so I don't know the regimen of treatment for leprosy other than the fact that one of the components in the leprosy treatment scheme is thalidomide. So that would be something that would need to be addressed by a colleague more familiar with that area than me. People asked about the airplane book, and yeah, I'm updating it, and I'll send that to Heather. And now, you know, keep in mind, it's my idea of interesting books to read on the airplane. A little story, and then we'll get back to work, and it actually is one that relates to risk assessment. So when my daughter was in the 2nd grade, you know, it's tough to be in public health, you and me, because folks don't always appreciate what we do. And when she was in the 2nd grade, they had a career fair, and she went to a private Catholic Girls Academy, Villa Victoria Catholic Academy for Girls. And so they had a career night, and I went to career night as a good parent with my daughter. And I said very politely to the principal, you know, sister, I would be very happy to participate in career night next time that you have it. And the nun looked very serious at me. He goes, oh, Dr. Robson, Christina told us what you do. God knows what that must have been. And so she didn't pursue it. So in the car on the way home, I said, Christina, what did you tell sister that Daddy does? And she goes, I told her I really wasn't sure what you did, but you measured a lot of stuff in pee, poop, and blood. And I suppose, you know, as a toxicologist and a health scientist, we do. That is the area that we work in. And so sometimes people don't understand what we do. I was once told when she was in the 5th grade, when she came home from a sleepover, that we had to have better magazines in the downstairs bathroom because where she visited they had Cosmo and Elle and everything else, and we had the Journal of Toxicology and the American Journal of Public Health. So, you know, each of us has a different perspective. But I do promise I will send Heather my airplane book list, and you can, you know, pick the ones that you like. It includes things like a brush with death, which is the story of lead poisoning in the United States, and paint. Dark Remedy, the thalidomide story. Acres of Skin, which is a really exciting one by Hornblum. That's the story of Albert Klingman, who's still alive, I think, who deep in his 90s, the person who came up with Retin-A. He was a young dermatologist at the University of Pennsylvania, did his research in the Holmesburg prison in Philadelphia prior to the whole notion of IRBs and those sorts of things. So there's some pretty, I think, some pretty interesting. The Poisoner's Handbook is the one I just read on the way back from Thailand, which was sort of a chronology of some famous poisonings, most of them in New York City at the turn of the last century. So I promise to send that. A lot of the questions folks asked about were, you know, what else do you need to know enough for the test? And I'll let Heather respond to some of that, but as you all know, this is just a review that scratches the surface. Your years of experience as a public health professional, some of you, that's a brief period of time, you're young in your career, other folks have been at it quite a while. That helps play into it, a little bit of review on all of these general topics. So this is just sort of to start you. So I would say, in all candor, this alone is not enough to prepare you that you, and I know you know that you need to do some additional studying. Okay. One person asked, do we have to memorize the toxicology details? No, I don't think that's why we put that up. We put that up to help you remember the basic principles of toxicology: acute and chronic, oral, dermal, and inhalation. And those concepts are things that hopefully are committed to memory, even if your expertise is as a health economist or your expertise is as a biostatistician. You remember those general environmental health concepts, just as if you are an environmental health person, the general concepts for epidemiology about standardized mortality ratios and RRs and ORs and things like that. Remember, this is a test it's a fairly broad-based test for a public health professional. So let's get back to work, and let's talk about risk assessment, which is a key component in environmental health. And a little cartoon that we borrowed, and as you can see, the fellow at the bottom goes, "Hey, I thought we were working on the same data." Risk assessment is a complicated, complex, not exact science. Risk assessment is a tool in our toolbox as public health professionals. You know, if you have an expert panel and people duke it out for 2 or 3 days at EPA or FDA or NIH, and we're a couple of orders of magnitude apart, me and you, we consider that an enormous success, and we thought we've done well. Risk assessment is a tough one, but it's a real part of what we do in environmental health. So we're just going to go over the basics. And so I wanted to share with you, the cartoon is one thing. We'll see if we can go back to that. That's one thing. But here's some examples. This is a study by Crouch and Wilson. It's an old study now. It's back in 1982. But let's look at taking the same data set and how we go ahead and represent it. So here's accidental deaths per million tons of coal mine in the United States in this window between 1950 and 1970. And the x-axis are the years, and the y-axis are the accidental deaths per million tons of coal. And so if we look at this data, which is the whole idea of the folks that wrote the article, if we look at this data, we would say, well, holy mackerel, things are looking pretty good. Coal industry is much safer. As we mine coal, the number of deaths over time has decreased. We can declare success. Now, take that same data, and let's look at accidental deaths per 1,000 coal mine employees in that window, 1950 to 1970. So this is the deaths per 1,000 employees on the y-axis, and the x-axis, once again, is the year. And now you see this is jumping all over the place. And so it's much harder to make a statement about this particular phenomena if you look at this one versus this one. And that's my point. I use this and still use this article in my class when I teach it, because I want people to realize that you can represent the data lots of different ways. And some of us are a little older, like me, where there was no PowerPoint or there wasn't any sophisticated statistical packages. I did all my thesis analysis with Fortran cards. The majority of the people on this phone call have webinar have no idea what a Fortran card is. But with sophisticated software and analysis, we can do a lot of things, and that includes how we represent the data, even if it's all legitimately represented. So I'm not suggesting that otherwise, other than the fact that there are lots of ways to represent data, and it can be a little bit tricky. Okay, so let's talk about this. This is something that we should know. Risk is equal to hazard times exposure. Important concept. Okay. This is a real basic tenet of environmental health. And the risk assessment process has 4 basic steps: hazard identification, the toxicity assessment, which is that dose response that we talked about before the break, the exposure assessment, and the risk characterization. Now, you and I are in public health, so we also worry about the risk management and the risk communication. If I were a physician or a nurse or someone who is a healthcare provider, I would worry a lot about risk management. It's one thing, as a toxicologist, I go, yeah, you're exposed, you're sick, you got cancer, you got a big problem. But if I'm the doctor or the nurse, he or she has to say, okay, you have this problem, and now the doctor has to manage it, and she has to say, all right, how am I going to treat you now that you have this illness? Or what course of action do we have to correct this? So risk management is an important component, particularly for people that are healthcare providers. And finally, all of us try very hard to do good risk communication. And that isn't so easy. A few years back, there was a compound called ethylene dibromide. And it was a compound, it's a fumigant. And accidentally, this goes back a couple of decades, accidentally a lot of grain was fumigated with this compound at the wrong dose, and EPA had to set a temporary tolerance for grain products, both processed like bread, cupcakes, and popcorn and things, as well as the grain itself. And so after a lot of evaluation, they came up with the fact that it was going to be 4 parts per million would be the temporary tolerance or residue, allowed residue for this particular chemical on this grain and the products. And so 49 states agreed to that number, and I believe it was Massachusetts decided they were going to set their standard at 2 instead of 4. You know, you can always be as stringent as the federal folks. You can never be less stringent than the federal folks. States have the right to have higher standards if they desire, as long as they don't violate any laws. So Massachusetts was 2, the rest of us were 4. The local TV reporter came in to talk to me about what is this compound and what that number meant. And she was a young, thoughtful, aggressive reporter. And so the cameraman was rolling, and again, this is in the 80s, so it wasn't as fancy as the news is today. And she said, Dr. Robson, New Jersey has adopted the federal number of 4. I said, yes, they have. And Massachusetts has made their safe level 2. I said, that's what I read today in the New York Times. So is it fair to say that the people in Massachusetts are better protected than the people in New Jersey? I said, no, it's not fair. Is it fair to say that we're at twice the risk? I said, absolutely not. And she goes, well, wouldn't you agree that 2 is half as much as 4? And I said, yes, I would. And then wouldn't you agree that 4 is twice as much as 2? And I said, absolutely. I mean, this is the kind of math I can handle, you know. And then she said, well, then the people in New Jersey have to be more at risk. And I said, absolutely not. So she stopped the camera, and she's arguing with me about the difference between 2 and 4. And I said, you know, 2, 4, 0, and 10, when we're working at that level, is the same darn number. And so people have to realize that. So I share this real little story with you, not because it's a particularly interesting story, but it's the fact that people look at these risk numbers or look at these levels and they really think that they are absolute. And you and I know, and if any of you on the call have ever done analytical chemistry as part of your research, either your job or your thesis, you know that the results can vary as much by the day of the week or the time of the day as it can from the samples and the people that you collected them from. So it's a really important thing when we communicate a risk number to be certain that we understand that it is a range-finding kind of number. It gives people an idea and magnitude of the problem as opposed to an absolute number that's either going to be better or worse. So just to point that out. In this little cartoon where they say, you know, what made him sick? And the doctor said negligible levels of carcinogens. I mean, it's really hard to determine what the absolute number is. Now, people can display it in different ways. This is an article the NRDC put an ad in the New York Times and all the major national newspapers, but this one I took I just took a photo from my New York Times of trying to describe the risk associated with chemicals, pesticides that were applied to apples. And this was a few years back, but you can see that glutathione being very, very toxic, methylparathione, methoxychloropyrifos. You know, the more dangerous the apple, the more you're exposed to. As you can see, the bottom ones are the bad guys. And there are lots of ways to demonstrate this. I think it's actually a fairly effective advertisement. Why do we fuss about this so much? Well, a good example is the story about LR. LR, or nimidazide, was a plant growth regulator that was manufactured and marketed by Oil Chemical. And it was applied to apples. It had many uses, but the example we have now are apples. And some of you that might be a little bit older will remember this story. And for some of you that are younger, you probably were drinking the apple juice at the time that this all came together. LR was applied to apples. It kept the apples on the trees longer. It made the red color more intense if it was a red-skinned apple. And they stayed a little longer in storage. So it had minimal benefits. What was the problem is that when the apple was processed, the LR metabolite was unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, and this compound has been shown to be a health problem. And so the unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, when you heat the apple, caused the problem, and people associated a not trivial risk to this, and EPA took action against Uniroyal, and eventually the compound, the registration was suspended. They didn't withdraw it, it was suspended. People stopped using it. And, you know, think about it, it's an apple, so these are things that everybody eats all the time. The challenge was the risk assessment, which is why I'm giving this example. The risk assessment was done on the fresh apple, and it was done on a fresh apple for an adult. And people said, oh, you know, and people were getting a little bit loose with the numbers. You know, you'd have to eat so many apples to get any appreciable exposure to unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine that, you know, the risk wasn't real. But it isn't the adult eating the fresh apple that is the real risk. And we're about to look at this example. So how do we eat apples? Well, most of us eat apples fresh. About a third of the apples we eat are processed. Grapes, fresh grapes, about 70% are processed. That would be grape juice and wine. And potatoes, we typically eat them fresh. Processed would be, of course, potato chips. And so what's the big deal? Why am I spending time with this example? And this is to demonstrate a principle, which is what I want you to get as you prepare for the examination, is let's look at ages. So the average person, fresh apples, and this is grams per kilogram. Remember, it's all about dose. Remember Paracelsus. Okay, it's about 0.4 grams per kilogram. Apple juice about 0.2. In infants, we can see it's much, much higher. Now, the LR, when processed, becomes the unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine. So that's the bad actor. And the bad actor happens with heat. So if you look at the apple juice that you and I might consume as adults, it's 0.2 grams per kilogram. It's pretty uneventful. The apple juice for an infant is considerably higher. So we're not protecting the average person. We're protecting the vulnerable population, the population at risk, which in fact in this case is the infant. So the risk assessment was done, but it wasn't done for the person at risk. We worry about the consumption of apple juice in children. I often joke that, you know, when you look at infants and then as they grow up, the natural progression for children and their beverages are mom's milk or formula, apple juice, and then Diet Coke. And that's sort of the natural progression. And look in the middle of this slide, because this is important. It's all about the apple juice consumed by the children. That's where the risk is. That's the population at risk, and that's not where the risk assessments first came out. And so when you look in the apple juice selection in the store, American apple juice folks, the manufacturers immediately stopped taking apples that had been treated with LR. They wanted to protect their market. So the marketplace moved quickly, which was a good thing for you and I as public health people. We like when that happens because that usually doesn't happen. And also they made a point of putting the country of origin. I took this picture at my grocery store right before I was actually ordered out of the store. I had called ahead of time to ask if I could take pictures, and the guy that agreed to it clearly was not there when I came there. So me and my Canon camera left, but not without a few pictures of apple juice. So we look at fresh apples, we look at processed apples, and we have to decide what the real risk is, how you're exposed, and then most importantly, who is at risk. Now there's probably some Hopkins grads on the phone today, or on the webinar today, and they can be very proud that saccharin, which is a great risk assessment story, saccharin was produced at Johns Hopkins back in 1878. And it wasn't until there was an interest in sugar shortages that it became fairly popular. And then its use increased again in the 60s and 70s as people were looking for calorie-free sweeteners. And the most famous one in that little pink packet for saccharin is sweet and low. And there's the chemistry of it, and there's the little sweet and low packet that we're also familiar with. Now what's interesting is this time, studies in laboratory rats in the 70s linked saccharin with the development of bladder cancer in rats. And for that reason, Congress took a really interesting step. They mandated that when you found the product, it would say use of this product may be hazardous to your health. This product contains saccharin, which has been determined to cause cancer in laboratory animals. This was pretty bold for the 1970s. Now, what's interesting is that it did cause cancer in the rats, but it was a particular strain of rat. And so, unlike the thalidomide story, where they didn't have a wide enough range of animals that would demonstrate the same effect as we have in humans, the phocomilia, this time, this particular group of rats are the rats that had, these rats had the mechanistic, they did the mechanistic studies, and they had the metabolism to cause the cancer, the bladder cancer. It did not cause bladder cancer in people. And so it got off that list. So here's an example of where a risk assessment was done. They did it properly. They did it in laboratory animals. They saw the bladder cancer. The government moved. They put the regulatory statement on. And then with lots of subsequent research funded primarily by the beverage industry, because they were convinced that toxicology hadn't been done completely, found that it was just with the rat, and the model was not applicable to humans. So it's a complicated world, and when we do risk assessment, we have to remember that we want to look at the population. Risk is equal to hazard times exposure. The way to reduce risk is either to reduce the hazard, substitute it for something less toxic, less dangerous, or the exposure. Use PPE. Use better kinds of controls, environmental controls. Avoid contact one way or the other. So that's what the story is about risk. The risk numbers are a guide. They're not exact. And there are varying ways to do risk assessments. People will agree and disagree on what those components are in a good risk assessment. And they are an important public health tool. The last risk assessment story for you is one that I share with you as health scientist, because one of my own graduate students did this. He came to see me when he was buying a home. And he said, Dr. Robson, we found the home of our dreams, but it has radon. Now, some of you know about radon because it's a problem in your state, and others of you don't. Radon, of course, is naturally occurring. Radium daughters decay, and radon will settle in basements typically. And the U.S. EPA has set a standard of 4 picocuries per liter for a safe level for radon. And the endpoint in people is lung cancer. So it's not a good thing. We don't want it in our homes. If the level is particularly high, homes have to have remedial activity where you vent out the radon. As we moved in the 1970s to do a better job making our homes more energy efficient, we sealed up our homes, we caulked and we insulated and we patched, and we found ourselves trapping and containing some of these things like radon in the house. So the student came and said they found the house of their dreams, but they had to remediate it because they had 4.3 picocuries per liter, and the level's 4, and the lending agency, the bank, would not give them a loan until they remediated it. The seller didn't want to remediate. He didn't want to pay the bill. So the buyer, this was when the market was to the seller's advantage, the buyer would have to do it, and they had maxed out on their ability to buy a home. So I said, well, who's taking the samples? They said, well, we are. They gave them the canisters. They said, well, just open the cellar windows and take the level, take the sample, and then send it in, and your level will be low enough that you'll get your mortgage. And it did. It came back like 3.1 or something. I said, but what I want you to remember as a public health person is not the difference, that 4.3 and 3.1 are the same number. And you can make the number work for you any way you want, but that you still need to remediate the radon in the basement if you spend any appreciable time in there. Don't just think because you've got a number of 3.1 instead of 4.3 that you've solved your problem. So let's look at now 3 important matrices for environmental health. The first one will be air. Okay? And so it's interesting, you know, the earliest form of anthropogenic airborne emissions is wood smoke. From the beginning of time, humans have required some warmth. Certainly if you're in the Northeast, you required it the last week, as well as fuel for cooking. Okay? It's not a new concept. Coal smoke contributed greatly to the air pollution problems in the days of the Industrial Revolution. Airborne emissions from coal and wood have been around since the beginning of time and have been a major contributor. And here's a little cartoon that comes from US EPA, and you can see the sources of air pollution. And the reason I share this cartoon is not so much because you don't already know this, but just to sort of summarize where the sources are. Now there's the big sources, the outdoor sources that come from an industrial situation like we see on the far side of the slide. But people forget that there is not an insignificant number of sources of air pollution inside, in your office, in your home, in your school, and other places where you're inside. And these are everything that come off from your appliances to your automobile to your laptop and computer. So there's NOx and SOx, sulfur dioxide, the nitrous oxide compounds, CO2, CO, as well as respirable particulate matter and lead and volatile organics. There's a lot of things that are in the house. And then you see on the far side of that little picture the radon that's seeping through the floor. So air pollution is not a trivial issue, and air pollution is something you need to familiarize yourself a little bit with as you get ready for the test. So here's a famous picture from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in 1948. And this is Donora, Pennsylvania at noon. Donora is a town, an industrial town not too far from Pittsburgh. And one of the challenges is the famous story about small industrial town that 20 people died and over 7,000 people were hospitalized between October 26 and 31 in 1948. And it was a result of a temperature inversion. There was an air inversion, which the cold air trapped the materials that were coming off of the processing plants, zinc, acid plant, steel mills, iron mills, and because it had an ozone, it had an air inversion, temperature inversion, not ozone, but temperature inversion, that air and those pollutants stayed close to the ground and affected these 7,000 people, 20 of whom died in this small town. And this is a landmark case, a landmark event in environmental health, because this Donora smog example was one of the catalysts for the Clean Air Act that we have today, so it's a fairly famous one. The other famous air pollution incident, which didn't happen in our country, is the Great London Smog of 1952, and here's a picture of London during the daytime where people could not even see across the street. And it's pretty remarkable when you look at the data that they had. If you plot deaths, so on any good day in London at the time in 1952, 250 to 300 people die a day just from regular causes, everything from old age to being struck by an automobile to end of life after a long prolonged illness. So it's about 250 deaths per day. What was remarkable was because of climatic conditions and cold weather, people were burning more fuel in their chimneys. And the smoke, you can see the smoke measured in milligrams per cubic meter, increased dramatically over this 2-week period. And with it, we track almost perfectly the number of deaths. So the deaths went from 250 to almost 1,000 per day. And it correlates very closely to the emissions from the heat source. And if you, I think Google Images is such a remarkable thing. If you Google, under Google Images, climatic conditions in London on 5 December 1952, amazingly, this graphic comes up. I just think that's so incredible. And you can see what happened where you had the weather inversion and the high was stalled, and so the air didn't move, and so London found itself with that remarkably high level of pollution and the smog and the resultant deaths of near 1,000 people per day, 4 times the average amount. So there are types and sources of emissions to the air. Air pollutants are categorized for regulatory purposes, and we have the criteria air pollutants, and we call them CAPs, and we have the toxic air contaminants. And these criteria air pollutants are typically things that are in smog and chemicals that are emitted in large quantities like carbon monoxide and lead and ozone, particulate matter, and so on. These pollutants, EPA has established a national ambient air quality standard for these. Now, the toxic air contaminants are sort of everything else. If it's not a cap, it's a TAC. And for these, there are some regulatory concern that it's regulated a little differently. There are primary standards and there are secondary standards. I would know that. Primary standard is set to protect public health, including those sensitive populations that we mentioned before, the elderly, children, asthmatics, people with certain kinds of health conditions. And the secondary standard is set to limit, the limits are set to protect public welfare, including things like decreased visibilities in automobile accidents, damage to animals, to crops, like ozone damage to crops, which severely affect its ability, the corn or the soybeans to photosynthesize, building damage. If you look at the great monuments in many Eastern European cities, all those years of coal burning and industrial activity, the acid rain, the mixing of the sulfur compounds in the atmosphere with the rain, and you start to see historic monuments and things seriously damaged over time. So, as you might guess, the number one air pollution problem is the use of automobiles. Motor vehicles account for about 1/4 of the emissions that produce ozone, about 1/3 of the NOx emissions. Particulate and sulfur dioxide emissions from motor vehicles represent a significant amount as well, particularly the particulates, almost 1/5 or 20%. And finally, almost 3/4 of the carbon monoxide emissions are produced from transportation sources. So if you were hard-pressed, I don't think it's a question that you're going to have here, but if you're hard-pressed to say what's one great way to solve the air pollution problem in the United States or anywhere in the world, the answer, of course, is to reduce the amount of automobile traffic. People have attributed healthcare costs to the air pollution problem. It's estimated that cost of human exposure to all outdoor air pollution ranges from 40 to 50 billion, that's with a B, $billion. And associated with that 40 to 50 billion dollars is a $50,000 premature deaths, 50,000 premature deaths. Okay. So it's pretty significant. When we look at ground level ozone or smog, it results in lots and lots of ER visits, emergency room visits, about 50,000 and 15,000 or so admissions to the hospital, according to the American Lung folks. And so we know that we have about 64,000 Americans that die each year from lung and heart disease that are caused by air pollution-related pollutants, things like fine particulates from power plants or cars. It's a real public health issue. As we said over and over again, we're about susceptible populations, and certainly children are very much in the line of fire. They're in the outside playing, especially children that have some health issues. We see an increased incidence in pneumonia, bronchitis, and other diseases from children's exposure to air pollution. Increase associated with asthma and asthma severity, but of course a whole range of other things as a result of smog and climate change, acid rain like the cartoon shows us. The common air pollutants that we worry about mostly in public health, these are not exclusive, but they're the most important ones: ozone, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, lead, and particulate matter. One question that we get asked a lot in public health, people will say, well, I'm really confused, Dr. Robson, because they're worried about the hole in the ozone layer. And at the same time, they're complaining in the paper about the ozone problem. What's the deal? And that's a very reasonable question. So as we point out here, the good ozone versus the bad ozone. So the good ozone, remember, is the one up high above us in the stratosphere that blocks out the UVB radiation and keeps us safe from these damaging rays. The bad ozone is that ozone that's right down here in our breathing zone that's created from the chemical reaction of the NOx with the VOCs, the volatile organic compounds, in the presence of heat and sunlight. So bad ozone is VOC plus NOx plus heat plus sunlight. That equals the bad ozone. So we have the one that's blocking out the UVB rays. Remember that hole in the ozone layer, of course, is what's allowing for the increased incidence of radiation, the increase in temperature, the increase in skin cancer, increase in cataracts. So that is the stratospheric ozone is the one that we must maintain or keep safe. And the other one is the result of basically increased motor vehicle traffic. The health effects, of course, reduced lung function, serious breathing problems, lots of irritation for eyes and nose, and usually reduces our resistance to infection. Levels in homes, even without gas stoves, can be 0.5 to 5 ppm. If you have a gas stove, it can go up to 15 ppm. And of course, homes that are poorly ventilated, stoves that are poorly ventilated, up to 30 ppm. There's some spectacular public health work done by Dr. Kirk Smith, a bunch of folks in California. Absolutely elegant work done by that group. They're just small improvements in ventilation of homes and stove design remarkably improve the quality of life and the reduction of respiratory diseases in folks in the developing world, particularly India and China. Great public health in action. So let's use my state as an example. These are days in which we exceeded that 1 hour ozone standard in New Jersey, and they give you a range here from 88 to 2003. And you can see there are periods of time the data just jumps all over the place. So these are ozone exceedance days. There's a 1 hour standard that's set up by the state and by the federal EPA. And then these are days when we go over that. And in 1988, as you can see, we had 45 days where we were over the standard. And we started to make some progress, but then in 91 it jumped again. And every once in a while we think we have improved things, and you can see even at the tail end of this graph that we had gone back up again. It's a function of lots of things, including climatic conditions, automobile traffic, and other things. Carbon monoxide is one of those tricky air pollutants that we worry about. It's on our top 6 list. It's a problem because it's colorless, odorless, it doesn't irritate. And it's generated by the incomplete combustion of carbon-contained fuels, and it's one of the leading causes of poisonings in the United States. As we got through the last 2 weeks of remarkably cold weather here in the Northeast, reports every day about people dying from carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated heating equipment. The outdoor sources, as you can see in the picture, the big source, of course, is transportation. Indoor sources, leaky chimneys, poorly ventilated furnaces, and poorly ventilated stoves, and those levels are levels that we mentioned earlier. This is kind of an interesting slide, so I put it in. This is the carbon monoxide concentration and how it changes over time and its effect as it relates to traffic. Low wind and low temperature conditions also contribute to the accumulation of CO levels. And so you see as the wind speed changes, okay, we have changes in the CO levels. Okay. You can see that traffic influences the CO levels. So it's pretty amazing that the blue line is the CO concentration. But you can see the other variables and how they affect it. As the traffic pattern starts to peak, the CO still goes up just because there's some residual in the system. As the wind dies down, of course, the CO concentration goes up as well. Just like the story about London and about Danora, you can see what happens when we have the air inversion. Okay. In fact, this is probably a better cartoon. You have warm air And as you go up into the atmosphere, the air is cool, and we have that mixing, and the pollutants from industrial sources and from homes is carried up into the air. If we have a warm air inversion, and the air gets trapped, the cool air gets trapped, we'll find ourselves with like putting a lid on a jar, if you will. That's the analogy that most atmospheric folks like to give. And they'll tell you that there's just no place for these pollutants to move. Nitrogen dioxide is a brown, highly reactive gas that's present in most all urban atmospheres, and it's fossil fuel derived. Like the other sources, it's all about unvented gas stoves or poorly ventilated ones, environmental tobacco smoke, and of course automobiles. It's interesting that the average homes without combustion appliances is about half of what it is outdoors. Homes with gas appliances often exceed the outdoor levels of NOx, which is kind of an interesting thing. As with this carbon monoxide, concentrations of NOx are highest during the AM and PM rush hours, again because of its association with motor vehicle travel. Whereas we get ready for our second break, we'll just finish up the air pollutants, sulfur dioxide, largely from stationary sources, such as refineries and smelters. Again, it's irritant to the eye, nose, throat, respiratory tract. It can cause long-term damage to your lungs and also can aggravate CVD. The aerosols can eat away at stone to buildings. We talked about that before. Large monuments in lots of major cities around the world, especially those with a lot of industrial activity and coal burning. You can see the damage to those monuments. Lead's one that public health has looked at for a very long time. Lead is a metal that occurs naturally, we know that, as well as part of human activity. Lead in gasoline is no longer used in the United States. It was phased out. Lead in paint was removed. And so the lead levels in people, the blood lead levels, have been decreasing over time in children. It's around 2.5 micrograms per deciliter, which is a remarkable achievement. Some outstanding work done by the CDC and many schools of public health, most notably the pioneering work done by Dr. Herbert Needleman at Pittsburgh, who was both ingenious in the way that he studied the problem and courageous in the way that he defended his results, which make him, in my mind, one of those great public health heroes. Okay. Lead is one that is a neurotoxin, as we know. Some lead-containing chemicals can also cause cancer in some laboratory studies in animals, and also some digestive issues, but we mainly focus our concern as public health people on the neurotoxic effects, on decreased IQ, on attention deficit, and other things. Particulate matter is the dust, the dirt, the soot, the stuff that you can breathe. You know, a lot of these things you can't see, but the particulate matter you can, and the particulate matter sometimes sees you before you see it. As you breathe this in, it'll cause obstructions, it'll cause difficulty in breathing. It can blow like dust from fires. Interestingly, in Asian cities, the Indonesian sugar fields and rice fields are burned off, and in such enormous acreage, you know, thousands of hectares, so much so that it blows up through Malaysia and up into Thailand and affects the air quality in the cities 2 countries away, and the enormous respiratory problems for folks. Particulate matter is, like all of them, causes eye, nose, and throat irritation. It's the haze that is a challenge for reducing visibility. You can just look at pictures from Beijing and see that they even have days where they cannot operate the airport because the airplanes, even with the navigational devices, still need to see where they're going, and they can't. It's just an enormous problem. Particulate matter is huge. This is a nifty little slide, and this is a day in the life of one person's exposure to respirable particles or particulate matter. And you can see how it goes up and down over the course of the day as the person starts their day at about 6 o'clock and wakes up. But what's so interesting to me is if you move to the far side of the slide, that one of the greater exposures for these folks are in fact in their kitchen, in their dining room, in their home. I think that's just pretty amazing. This is an older slide, but it really is quite a remarkable piece of work. And I have no idea why the citation is up in the corner and it seems to have not copied well up on the screen, but this is obviously cited from a research article. Outdoor versus indoor, remember that people spend an awful lot of time indoors. Statistics tell us that it's about 87 to 90% of our time is indoors. People who are more at risk may in fact spend more time, like children and elderly people, more like 95%. And because the duration of the exposure is significant, even if the concentration is low, we worry about indoor air pollutants. Here are some pictures from an EPA publication of sources of indoor air pollution, and they range everything from your fireplace to your automobile to the gas range. We talked about that, especially if it's not properly ventilated, to a wood stove, to your dry cleaning. There are lots of sources in your home. Environmental tobacco smoke is also an enormous indoor air pollutant, one that is a cause of concern. Thankfully, as we have a better appreciation for the risks associated with smoking, we see people are more mindful about, if they do smoke, not smoking indoors. But you can see that there are people at risk. The EPA says there's about 3,000 lung cancers that result in death per year for people who are not smokers, but are just exposed to secondhand environmental tobacco smoke. Asbestos is a known human carcinogen. There are lots of compounds where we think they might be a probable or possible or suspected carcinogen. We know for a fact that asbestos is a known human carcinogen. For lung cancer, and it is a very serious one, it was used in heating insulation and acoustic insulation. It was used for floor and ceiling tiles and for shingles. Okay? So these insulation properties that made it so beneficial from an industrial perspective also made it so widespread in its use in our contact. As you know, homes and buildings that are public buildings often have to be remediated. The removal for the insulation is very complicated. It's very expensive, and there are lots of people that argue that the removal will go ahead and actually have the compounds airborne and put you at greater risk. There's a lot of debate, but in the end, asbestos is a serious indoor and air pollutant, and we need to handle it appropriately. Here are the fibers. Some of the most elegant work for this was done at Mount Sinai in New York City under Dr. Irving Selikoff, a great pioneer in public health, another public health hero like Dr. Needleman. There are wonderful examples of public health heroes, you know, from Rachel Carson to Irving Selikoff. And asbestos is one where Dr. Selikoff really led the charge. And it's interesting that here's an advertisement from Asbestos Magazine in 1981 where they're talking about the asbestos in the Twin Towers. So it's a long time problem, and will be a long time until we get it resolved. Radon. Radon I mentioned before with my little example from my student. It's the radon decay products, the radionucleotides, which are inhaled and cause lung cancer. There's a little example of radon sources in the home. It's a public health challenge for us. Radon in one town can have very high rates depending on the geology and the geological formations underneath. Homes and buildings, you can have either high levels of radon or very low levels. It's pretty interesting how the pattern is dispersed. EPA thinks there's about 6 million homes in the country that have elevated radon levels, and it's the second leading cause of lung cancer following smoking. That's one of those facts that people don't necessarily know. I mean, smoking, we know about smoking and lung cancer, but radon is number 2. And there's a synergy, just like there's a synergy with asbestos in smoking for lung cancer. There's a synergy with tobacco smoking and radon. Okay, it's 2 o'clock. So far, so good. We haven't lost anybody, and I'm grateful for that. We're going to take another 10-minute biology break, and I'll read some more questions and see you all in 10. And we're getting towards the home stretch, so don't worry. Okay, friends, we're in the home stretch for the third hour. Hard to believe it's the third hour, isn't it? Third hour of our environmental health discussion. I was chuckling to myself since I can't hear any of you and you're stuck listening to me. I was thinking about a presentation. Our medical school used to have a different evaluation for courses than they currently do, and the students could write a lot more in the old system. And after the environmental health course that I taught for many years in our School of Public Health, the question was, what did you get from this course? And two smart-ass medical students wrote PowerPoint poisoning. And so as we enter the third hour, maybe they were right and maybe we're all about to get PowerPoint poisoning. I don't know, but I appreciate you hanging in there. There's still 79 people, and I'm grateful for that. So let's look at the two other matrices, water and food, and then finally talk a little bit about kids as we wrap it up. So there were some questions on, some of them are very practical ones that Heather's answered about how to find links and where to get the information. There were a couple questions about detail. Oh, someone asked, what is a VOC? That's a good question. I apologize. It's a volatile organic compound, okay, chemical that's highly volatile, meaning it easily moves about. One question was, what about, again, will the slides you post? The answer is yes. Why when the traffic levels go up, did the CO levels go down? There's a lag. That's part of it is a lag, and part of it is you saw the relationships of the wind speed. So if this wind speed is up, then between the natural lag as well as the wind movement, that affects the CO levels. Okay, so let's look at water. The hydrologic cycle is borrowed from the USGS. In public health, we're great borrowers. I don't think there were any of us that were too original in any of this, so we borrow things. But these things I always try to cite the sources, the EPA, USGS. They always have the nicest graphics and directly from some journal articles, so that we give you the correct science information. But here's the hydrologic cycle that we know fairly well, and so it's sort of a constantly evolving circulating system from evaporation back into the sky to condensation, back down to precipitation, and so on. It's the basis for our concern about water. 71% of the water surface, Earth's surface is water, but most of it's salt water, almost 98%. 2% of the water is in glacier and ice caps. That leaves us about 1% of the waters available for us in rivers and lakes and groundwater. And about 96.5% of that fresh water is in fact groundwater. Water is such a critical public health topic. Humans have an absolute dependence on water. We can go a long time without food, but not very long without water, maybe a couple days. Water constitutes most of us, about 65%, a little higher in kids. Our blood is 83% water. A statistic that may surprise you is that even bone is about 25% water. And so we need about 1 to 3 quarts of water a day just to keep our systems moving. Typically they'll tell you how many gallons per person you need to make a municipal sewage program work. Well, our personal program needs about 1 to 3 quarts per day just to maintain normal bodily function. Our standard of living requires a minimum of 100 quarts per day. That statistic about the planners figure on about 100 quarts per day when they capitate water use for septic systems and transport of waste. In affluent societies like ours, that 100 minimum is closer to 400. It's about 4 times as much. We routinely in the United States use more water than anyone else. Water is such a very costly commodity in developing countries. In Haiti, for instance, 20% of people's household budget is spent on water. As we mentioned in the beginning of the talk, WHO says that you could reduce diarrheal disease by 25% if you went ahead and improved access. And if you improved access and quality, you could reduce diarrheal disease by a third. So it's in the review, I'm sure, but we take a little credit for him too, which is John Snow and the Broad Street Pump. And you know the story. It's a classic environmental epidemiology. It's a shoe leather epidemiology. 1954 in London, they had a severe epidemic of Asiatic cholera. And it caused watery diarrhea, vomiting, rapid dehydration, and a lot of people died. John Snow observed this death rate to be about 200 per 10,000 in one part of London, and he noticed it was more distinct there than other places. Now, he didn't know about the cholera bacillus, but he did, through good epidemiological methods, as legend says, took the handle off the Broad Street Pump so people couldn't use that well. And there's Dr. Snow, rather regal-looking soul, and here is the public health notice that was put out about the looseness of bowels and the beginning of cholera, and went on to explain what those symptoms are and how you manage it. From Snow's own plotting, you can see the cases, and the X is where the pumps are, and the indication of where the deaths are in individual homes. And as you can see in the center there by Broad Street is where the epicenter is for the deaths for the pump. There is the pump. If you visit London, you can see the pump. It's all public health people should do that when they go, much to the dismay of their family and friends that travel with them. So what about that Broad Street Pump? What do we care about that? Well, because we go into the unknown when we look for water. We go into the water table, we drill, and down it goes, and there is usually a saturated zone, an unsaturated zone, and the goal, of course, is to try and get water that is not going to be polluted, that's not going to have microbial contamination, and to go ahead and get it in a layer that has adequate water supply that will support the well that you place into that zone. Microbial waterborne disease has been a problem for a very long time. Some of the more famous incidents in the 1880s, typhoid killed 100 out of every 100,000 people in the United States. In 1885, people in Chicago, when the Chicago sewage system was diverted into Lake Michigan, 90,000 people were victims from microbial waterborne disease. Today, about 3 million kids die from waterborne diarrheal disease, and almost all of this is as a result of the lack of adequate sewage disposal. It really is a big deal. I just want to tell you a story which I meant to tell you before, but it's a water story, so this will work here. Remember when we mentioned about those risk numbers and how they give us a range, they give us an idea about something, they help us prioritize, they help us maybe direct resources. We all have such limited resources anyway, but they help give us some direction. But one of the more interesting little experiences I had as a public health person was invited a few years back to give a risk assessment talk in Ghana at the University of Ghana in Accra. And I gave my talk about risk assessment, 1 in a million risk, that standard, the de minimis risk. The shorthand, remember, is 10 to the minus 6 when we write it. And as I was giving the presentation, I watched a young woman in the back of the room just move constantly in her seat. She looked to be remarkably uncomfortable with my presentation. So I was hoping that maybe she just had an uncomfortable chair, but in fact, I was the reason for her discomfort. When I finished my talk, and after the polite applause, her hand shot up with I asked for questions, and she said, "Dr. Robson, I am a pediatrician in Kumasi, and where I practice, 1 in 5 children will die of diarrheal disease before they're 8 years old. And 1 in 5 children will die of malaria before they're 8 years old. That's 2 in 5, or 4 in 10, or 400,000 in a million. That's a real risk number, not your 1 in a million risk number. I'm not sure why you came to give this talk, but I find it to be so impertinent, so irrelevant, so ridiculous, I don't know why you came," and sat down. So I thanked her very much for her thoughtful comments, and I realized that she was right. When you look at those numbers of people who don't have adequate safe drinking water and the number of kids who will die of diarrheal disease, my 1 in a million risk talk which, by the way, was the topic I was assigned to give, really isn't that spot on. In fact, what was interesting was that when it was suggested to me to make this the topic, I politely suggested that something else might be more relevant, only to be told that people in the developing world wanted the same standards as those of us in the developed world, and who was I to not want to provide that information to them just because it's a developing country. It was pretty much a lose-lose on that one, but we have those days sometimes. Back to our story. So municipal sewage treatment, wastes were dumped into open cesspools near a well, and there used to be brick lane, and the water would seep into the ground, and the pathogens would contaminate the wells. Cesspools worked pretty well until the advent of the flush toilet. When the flush toilet came along, the volume of wastewater was very, very large. Prior to that, it had been very small. And so we had an entire new public health challenge with a big increase in waterborne diseases, particularly cholera and typhoid, with the advent of the flush toilet, for which we are grateful we have, but at the same time it did cause a whole lot of challenges. Today in the United States, about 70% of the population, the water from the waste goes to the sewage treatment plant. Those are called publicly owned treatment works, okay? And primary treatment is when we go ahead and we take that sewage, which has human feces and urine and laundry waste, bathing waste, garbage, grinding, and dishwasher water. Sometimes it even has rats and bats and sticks and leaves and baseballs and every other thing. That's pretty much what's in that water as it goes to the primary treatment. So the first goal in primary treatment, of course, is to screen and remove these suspended materials, to grind those solids into a more uniform size, and to, using a sediment tank, try to have them settle out and the sludge is dried and disposed of. Primary treatment will remove usually about 50 to 60% of the suspended solids, and we reduce the biochemical oxygen demand by 25 to 40%. We go on to secondary treatment, where we go ahead and filter and use activated sludge, and we try to further reduce the solids and further reduce the biochemical oxygen demand. In other words, we want to get out of the organic matter and clean up the water, take out the solids, and remove the organic material. That's what we do in publicly owned treatment works. And then on, of course, it's treated and it's discharged. For a lot of people, about a third of the people that live in the United States, they are not on the sewer system, the town sewer. They are, in fact, on their own private septic system. And this is a different model. This is where liquid wastes are deliberately discharged into the ground. The problem is that with those wastes, especially historically, we had salmonella, hepatitis, and typhoid associated with well water contamination when the well water is contaminated by the septic system. The septic system has two parts: a tank that's buried in the ground connected by a pipe with a soil absorption field or sand filter, and the sewage tank is the sewage in the tank is partially decomposed by bacteria. The solids settle to the bottom, the lighter solids and the grease rise to the top, and the liquid passes on and out, and it goes into an absorption field. And people forget that they must have their septic systems pumped probably every 3 or 5 years. I have mine done every 2 years to avoid having the system clog up and have the system collapse. So here's a little graphic. You can see you flush the toilet in the house, the waste goes to the septic tank, the solids go to the bottom, the water goes to the top, it goes out, it goes into the drain field, and then makes its way through the soil. And as it goes through the soil, the purification occurs, and it goes back to the groundwater. Another little example, the same sort of thing. You see, we have a septic tank, a treatment field. Now, what is important in this picture, and which is a great challenge when you have municipalities that allow for small lot sizes, is that the well, which you see on the far side of the picture, can be in too close proximity to the sewage treatment plant, which is on the sewage the septic tank, which is on the other side of the picture, and you can have contamination. So this is a real serious issue, and many municipalities allow for very small lot sizes, and it drives us in public health crazy because we know it's just going to be a problem. Now, there are about 225 chemical, biological, and radiological pollutants that US EPA has identified in groundwater, and the majority of them are anthropogenic. They happen because of us, and that we didn't have good waste practices, or we've managed the land poorly. The primary drinking water contaminants are the chlorinated solvents from industrial kinds of activity. They typically are cause for concern for cancer. The trihalomethanes, which are produced by chemical reactions in water with chlorine, again, cancer, liver, and kidney, okay, the THMs, and lead. Lead just won't go away. I once said, if you're in trouble on a public health test, don't leave it blank. Write the word lead, age, sex, but lead is always a good answer. Age and sex are always a good answer. Never leave one empty. Old pipes and solder and water systems. Talked before about the neurological issues associated with that. PCBs from industrial behavior. PCBs, remember, were a major insulator for transformers, and when the PCBs leak or are damaged, the transformers damaged and the PCBs leak into the water supply, these compounds are very persistent compounds. They don't break down very well, and can cause both liver damage and cancer. And of course, other primary drinking water contaminants are bacteria and viruses. And here, if we have leaking septic tanks or overflow sewer lines, we find ourselves with a serious problem. We can get things like serious diseases like meningitis or GI illnesses. The trihalomethanes are worth discussing. In the 1970s, it was determined that chlorine added with water that has humic substances would produce some unintended chemical reactions, forming something that we call DBPs, the disinfection byproducts. The major DBT is a THM, okay, a trihalomethane. Trihalomethanes in high doses can cause liver and kidney disorders, nervous system problems, birth defects, and cancer. But at the end of the day, chlorine is still, this is where public health risk assessment becomes real. Chlorine is still a very cheap, effective way to disinfect water. That's the good news. The bad news is that if you have a lot of organic material, humic substances in the water, you will have the formation of trihalomethanes, which have the health problems that we just discussed. It's pretty amazing that EPA estimates that 40 million of the 300 million Americans are drinking water that has lead levels over the safe drinking water level. Okay? It comes from pipes, it comes from solder, it comes from corrosive activity of the pipes. Before 1930s, we had lead pipes. After 1930, we didn't have lead pipes. We had copper pipes, but the solder, the stuff that holds the copper pipes together, had lead in it. Coliform bacteria is a concern when we look at water pollution. The presence of appreciable numbers of coliform bacteria in a water sample are an indicator. It's interesting because coliforms themselves really aren't that big a problem, but they're an indicator. They're an indicator because they are present in great numbers in pathogenic bacteria in the intestines of warm-blooded animals. So if you have high levels, it tells you the water is polluted. I've used the term a couple of times. I should have defined it better, so I will now. Biochemical oxygen demand, BOD. Sometimes you'll see in some textbooks biological oxygen demand, but the most common way to describe it is biochemical oxygen demand. And what you need to remember, at least for our discussions for this exercise, is that low BOD means you have good water quality. High BOD means that you have poor polluted conditions. Okay, so if you need have a high biochemical oxygen demand, it means that you have a pollution problem. When bacteria act on organic sludge, large amounts of the dissolved oxygen are used up. That's why you have high BOD. And this can result in low levels of oxygen in the water, which mean that you have increase in fish kills and things like that. So how do we purify water? And there's a question that popped up about the steps, so we're going to go back to that now. This is water for drinking. We have sedimentation, where the water comes in and it settles out. The sediments literally settle out. We use coagulation, next step, which is usually hydrated aluminum sulfate. It's added to the water and it forms flocks, F-L-O-C-S. So you flocculate, and these precipitate out the suspended solids. And we filter it, typically through beds of sand or anthracite. And then finally we disinfect it. The most common disinfection is still chlorine, but other folks use ozone, and some small systems use UV light. Chlorination is a very popular way to purify water. It goes back to 1908 Chicago, when we first started using chlorine. Chlorination in drinking water can take credit for some of the great strides in public health, especially the decreases in infectious gastrointestinal disease. About 75% of the United States water supply still use chlorine because it's cheap, because it works, and there's residual. On a week like this week, where you have temperatures in the single digits or below zero, you have lots of broken water mains. And as those pipes are exposed, the thing that keeps this from becoming a real public health tragedy is that there's always some residual chlorine in the lines that help fight the contamination before the time it takes to get the pipes fixed and get the water system back online. This is a picture I took in Kopčanica in Romania, and this reminds us that water supplies are not always that careful and that safe. And here is a community water supply with a bucket that's down open top, lots of microbial contamination. And what you don't know is that in the next picture that I took, there's actually a horse barn, so there's actually some animal waste that makes its way down to the well. This is a water supply in Ghana, not far from the capital, and near Accra. And as you can see in the picture, ladies are doing laundry and people are getting water to cook. Kids are taking a bath and swimming and playing. And this is the community water supply. So here's an interesting picture also taken in West Africa. Mayor and community leader, public housing, and the latrines for ladies on one side and for men on the other. And this is a new well. And looking at this well, what's interesting is that the well is very near this open sewer system. And so the question is, why would you do that? And the mayor responded that this is where people travel, that if you move the well to some other place, this is a new well and it's believed to be good water, but eventually it will have pollution problems associated with the open sewers, that this is where people walk. Public health is tough because it deals with people, it deals with the public. You can put the well far away from those homes, from those apartments, but then people are going to use that well. So this well has to be where the action is. This is what a well looks like in case you ever cared, or at least between now and maybe the exam you'll want to care. But you see, we have a screen at the bottom, the water comes in with a pump, and then of course it's piped out, and there's a sanitary covers to have access to the pump, and off it goes to the home. This little research that we did, which I think is kind of interesting, associated with water. In this third hour, I try to make it a little more interesting and put some actual research information. This is a little study we did in the south of Thailand where there are high levels of naturally occurring arsenic, natural occurring, so there's no responsible party. Okay, so you can see the WHO standard is 10 parts per billion to 10 ppb for arsenic, and the red dot we have between 200 and 1,000 ppb, micrograms per liter, of arsenic in the wells. These are shallow wells, and the water source for these folks in this village. And arsenic exposure leads to Bowen's disease, palmar-planar keratosis, these little keratotic lesions, and then finally full-blown skin cancer. And we had a real concern because these shallow wells were the people's water supply. We had a chance to do a natural experiment in this region because we got money from the Japanese government to dig deeper wells and then piped water to the village homes. But before that, people would dig the well themselves by hand. I gave this talk one time to medical residents, the whole study, and the one young physician goes, "Well, you missed the point. You just need to dig deeper wells." And I said, "Well, doctor, this is in the middle of nowhere in the south of Thailand. There are no well drilling apparatus. There is no skilled workers that know how to do it. And even if there were well drilling machines and people that knew how to run them, there's no money to pay the people to do it. A hand-dug well, we could start digging in the morning, and by the end of the day, we'd have a very nice well with water that would look pretty darn good. But it's got close to 200 to 1,000 ppb of arsenic. So here's this little boy taking a bath, and it's very cold water because I was there for a week and I had to bathe that way too. But it's got no arsenic, which was the good thing. Think about water and the exposure. Let's put it all together now as we get to the end of the talk. You're exposed to water when you swim. You're exposed to water when you bathe. You're exposed to water when you drink. You're exposed to water when you cook. If it's in water, chances are good it's going to be on or in you. We're going to look at food and children, and then we're going to wrap it up. Remember what I said before, 80 to 85%, depending on whose numbers you use, of the world are folks living in developing countries. And their food systems are primarily their major employment. In Thailand, 75% of the people are rural people that are on farms. This is a picture up in the north of Thailand of rice paddies. The food supply that we have is really spectacular. But as we try to look in public health at what we eat and how we eat it, we realize we have some holes in our data. How do you measure what the risk is? Well, you better understand what people eat and how much of it they eat. We were doing some work trying to see what people's pesticide exposure was in their eating. And the first thing we did was look at what people use to protect themselves when they apply pesticides, going back to our exposure discussion. The number one answer, none, is a very common answer all over the world. Certainly was here in this work. Working down, so you see numbers 4 and 5, knitting faces, hat, and loincloth, which I thought were interesting uses of protective clothing. But here's a farmer who, in his mind, is appropriate as he's producing food with his PPE. He's got short sleeve shirt, short pants, and a knitting faces hat, or you and I would call it a ski mask. People apply pesticides when they grow the food because they want to increase yields and increase quality, even if it also means an increased risk associated with the pesticide burden. This is a slide I stole from a colleague who I'm sure stole this from somebody else, but it's a great little picture. Of course, as a parent, I wonder how the heck they kept them all so still in those little flower pots. But it reminds us of growing children are, in fact, a critical group of people that we need to protect in public health. One of the great truisms in public health is that people are not big rats. And despite our attempts to make them so, there are major differences between rats and humans. And a less obvious truism is that children are not simply little adults. And so the public health considerations in environmental health for children are pretty serious. First and foremost, of course, is that the increase in unit body weight of air, water, and food associated with children. Also, there's different pharmacokinetic behaviors in absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. So kids are taking in higher levels of air, food, and water per unit size. And when they get those products in them and the associated contaminants, the pharmacokinetic behavior of those contaminants is very different in a child versus an adult. Think about how amazing it is that you go in a 26-week period from something that's microscopic to something that weighs 500 grams, about a pound. That's pretty amazing. And at that time, you know, all the body systems are formed at 26 weeks. You can live outside the uterine. Extrauterine existence is possible. It's a little risky, but it's possible. Add 12 more weeks to this, and at 38 weeks of gestation, you have something that weighs 3.5 kilograms or 7.5 pounds ready to go. And so from birth through adolescence, physical growth and functional maturation of the body continue, and so do the environmental health risks. One of the challenges, of course, is as we get to full maturation, we have to wait for the organ systems to mature, such as the central nervous system. These all, as we go forward, can be affected by the environmental conditions or environmental contaminants that we come in contact with. Kids, the rate of absorption is much higher. The rate of accumulation is much higher. And here's a good example of the ability of a neonate to eliminate drugs or chemicals via the kidney. The major excretion pathway that you and I have as adults is limited because the kidney is not developed in the neonate. The same thing with respirable particles and other kinds of toxic assaults. It's just a different model in kids. A newborn has about 10 million alveoli. By 8 years of age, they're up to 300 million. And so you see this surface area increase where the gas exchange takes place from 3 meters to 75 meters squared. So it's really interesting that there's a 20-fold increase from infancy to adulthood in the gas exchange area. And so kids are at risk. This little cartoon from EPA reminds us that, to protect kids, we have to be mindful of the fact that what they eat dietarily, the water they drink, the air they breathe are all very different from adults. It's been pointed out on more than one occasion. Here's a cover from U.S. News and World Report from back in 2000 about environmental risks associated with learning disabilities in children. This is one I stole from now Dean Howard Frumpkin at the University of Washington, but when he was at the CDC, I borrowed this presentation slide. Typical environmental exposures have always been infectious agents, fire byproducts, and heavy metals. But the typical ones for today are all those from the early years, plus the industrial chemicals, plus the chlorination byproducts, pesticides, heavy metals, and those resulting from motor vehicles. So the risk to mom, to baby, and to the unborn baby is pretty impressive. So here's an environmental health success story. Okay, here is the story of lead removal in the United States. And you can see that the blood lead levels, micrograms per deciliter, back in the mid-70s was about 12 or 13 micrograms per deciliter. Unleaded gas was introduced in 76. They put a lead paint ban in 78. And they had the first CDC grants. It's a CDC slide, so we have to give them their due. First CDC grants to talk about lead management ended in 1980. And so you sprint forward about a decade, and you see that the blood lead level has dropped significantly to just about 2. And as more and more good legislation takes place and we become better public health people, we'll continue to see that drop. Some people think that's a safe level. Other people say there is no safe level. I'm not a lead toxicologist, so I don't know. But as a good toxicologist, remember what Paracelsus said, it's the dose that makes the poison. The more we reduce it, the less there is of a risk. So I want to thank you very much for taking the time to sit through almost 3 hours of an environmental health review. I'm going to just click on some more of these questions. A lot of them Heather has answered. Some of them I don't know the answers to. Okay, let's see. What do we got here? By what percent is BOD reduced in secondary treatment? About 50%, so that's a good question. Okay. Can you explain more on the treatments of sewage? Sure. So in sewage treatment, our goal is a couple-fold. The first goal are to remove the solids. So let's talk about sewage treatment in a municipal setting where it's a publicly owned treatment work. And there we would go ahead and the sewage is transported away from the homes and the businesses and into a central area where it's treated. The first treatment is to remove large objects, things like baseball bats and brush. I've toured sewer treatment plants and to make pictures from my lectures, and I'm always intrigued at the things that you find, especially in large urban areas where the sewer systems are pretty old and the pipes are enormous. And you always think about things like, where Harrison Ford is escaping through the sewer system in some of those action movies. But the first move is to take out the big solids, and then you go ahead and concentrate on the organic waste and remove those, hopefully through sedimentation. You get sludge. Now the challenge, of course, is that the sludge is a problem. It has to be disposed of. There are some parts of the country where the sludge is of sufficient high quality that it can be used as a soil amendment and can be used to treat agricultural land and provide nitrogen and other nutrients for crops. But there are restrictions as to what crops can receive that sewage sludge, and so that's not a trivial issue, and it has to be handled in such a way that there are no pathogens that accompany the sludge out into the food supply. And so after we've removed the solids and we've cleaned up the water and filtered it, then we're going to disinfect it, and then it gets discharged back into a water body. And in some cases it makes its way back into the drinking water system. There was a comment years ago that from the time that water starts at the headwaters of the Danube and makes its way to the end of the Danube, that it goes in and out of 8 different people. I don't know how true that is, but it was pretty remarkable to think that that same water has gone in and out of so many folks. Okay, let's see. Has PM decreased with the availability of household air purifiers? That's a good question. So there are lots of home filtering systems. I have a electrostatic precipitator on my AC system when I replaced it. There are lots of ways to take out PM in the house and to filter the air. And so in homes, in individual workplaces, sure, that has helped improve that. Outside, of course, as we have more and more starting to burn different kinds of fuels, we can see in some cases some increases. Remember, about 75% of the greenhouse gases that are emitted come from one country, China, and so that's really quite a challenge. Here's an interesting thing: in certain areas in Michigan, houses are built along the waterfront and have the septics enter into the lakes. I thought this was against the law, and that's a good question. And the question is, yeah, there are some places where it is still grandfathered in. I visited out in Long Island a place that has septic rings, and these septic rings are the only way that people can dispose of their manage their septic and their household waste. Clearly, Long Island, where it's so sandy, the water system is so vulnerable, you would think that wouldn't be the case, but it is. Okay. I guess everything, okay, public owned treatment works. Okay, so we answered that one. I guess the rest of the questions are more about what's on the, what's OM, organic matter. Okay, that's a good question. And somebody liked my pee, poop, and blood story, and I appreciate that. And Susan, send me an email. We'll talk more about that sometime. It is very hard to explain to a bunch of religious sisters Filipini, a bunch of Catholic nuns, why your father does study pee, poop, and blood. Well, my dear colleagues, thank you for being kind listeners. I hope some of this was useful. I hope I didn't put most of you to sleep. I appreciate the opportunity. You can feel free to email me with any individual questions. Go through the website, and Heather and I will work on that. But if there's something that's of interest to you, I'd love to discuss it with you. Be well, be safe, and good luck on the examination. I'm sure you'll all do well. Okay, signing off now. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for joining us today. That ends the webinar.